Well, today we are glad to have you here in this continued space with our Black History Speaker Series. I'm Charlotte Green, and I want to welcome you, and I want to tell you a little bit about the Center for Global Partnerships and Learning, which is sponsoring this event. We do a lot of good work, my friends, and we are excited to be partners in all the work that goes on at the center when it comes to cultural diversity. And so we offer certificate programs, and we have a journal, Scholarship Without Borders. And we look forward to you submitting your papers or becoming a peer reviewer as part of the work here. But we also have the great fortune of inviting and elevating voices with our podcast and supporting our students as they seek to publish and do research and do the work of becoming amazing scholars. And so we thank you for being with us tonight. Our esteemed guest and speaker for this evening is Dr. J. Goosby Smith, who is the Vice President for Community Belonging and Chief Diversity Officer here at Pepperdine University. She's on the main campus, y'all. So we're excited to have her with us tonight. She said that she'd rather introduce herself because bios are boring. What I will say is that in the short time I've gotten to know Dr. Goosby Smith, she is a woman of faith, a woman dedicated to hearing the voices and elevating voices of those who are often not seen and making it part of the historical landscape by telling the story. And so the next voice you will hear is Dr. J. Goosby Smith. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So a little bit about myself to put things in context. From the academic standpoint, my degrees are initially in computer science, which is undergrad, and started in the corporate field that way. But then slowly saw the light and transitioned and got an MBA and a PhD focusing in organizational behavior. So since about 1996, I've been researching issues of race. I'm a graduate of Spelman College, which is, and also I have a Master of Divinity from ITC, which is in Atlanta. So my bookend degrees are from HBCUs, and it's through that lens that I'll be looking at this particular hidden figure. If you were here last year, I think I talked about different figures behind Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Well, one of those figures was Dr. Howard Washington Thurman. And so I'd like to share with you this evening and then engage in discussion with you about Thurman, because I think that his wisdom was centuries ahead of its time, and that he has so much to teach us about bridging a lot of the divides that we have in society, racial divides and others. And so I wanted to thank you all for having me back again. I was trying to figure out what to talk about, and I was talking with Gabby, and I was like, well, I'm just going to talk about what really interests me and which figure really interests me. And so a lot of times we hear a lot about Martin Luther King and where did his ideas come from? Well, the majority of his philosophy came from Howard Thurman. So I want to introduce you to some of these ideas of Howard Thurman. And essentially, he brought a love of grace and mercy and nonviolence and a relentless pursuit of justice. So my goal today is to celebrate Howard Thurman, who was a scholar. He was also known as a mystic, which is an individual that looks at developing a close and intimate relationship with God for themselves. And so not just relying upon books and not just relying upon others. He was also a prolific author, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about a book that he wrote called Jesus and the Disinherited. He was also an ordained Baptist preacher. and he was a teacher, and he was a contemplative theologian before that term even came about. So we're going to talk a little bit about Howard Washington Thurman. And it's really interesting that as I learned more about him in seminary, I remember as an 18-year-old at Spelman College in Atlanta, visiting Thurman Hall at Morehouse, because my boyfriend at the time lived in that dorm, but we won't talk about that. Oh my goodness, we're being recorded. Okay. Anyway, but the graphics lab was down there. Anybody who went to Spelman or Morehouse and was a dual degree engineering major knows about the graphics lab, where you learned to draft and T-squares and all those things. And so I knew he was an important historical figure, but it was only in attending my seminary the past couple of years that I really realized how revolutionary he was, and just began to scratch the surface of the impact that he had on the thinking and methods and spiritual health of not only Martin Luther King, but also others in the civil rights movement. In fact, he's known as the pastor of the civil rights movement. So some people criticized him because he was not out marching, but if everyone's marching, who's thinking and strategizing? So I want to share a little bit with you about Howard Thurman so you can get to know him up close. And someone said, well, Jay, do you have a PowerPoint? I have one slide, and I'm going to show you what Howard Thurman looks like. And then I'm going to take that slide down, and we are just going to have a conversation, because who needs slides in the dark at 6 o'clock? So this here is Dr. Howard Washington Thurman, and he was born in 1899, and he passed away in 1981. So he had a very good life. And if you could ever hear his voice is precisely the voice that you think is going to come out of this human being here. I encourage you to listen to his voice. It was a very deep, very contemplative baritone that was very slow and methodical. Anyway, he was born and raised in Jim Crow, Daytona Beach, Florida, in the late 1800s. So this is just 34 years after the Civil War had ended. And I identify with him so much really because he's born during the same decade that my paternal grandparents were born, and he died during the same decade that my paternal grandparents were born. And as I looked at them being born and raised in Mississippi and them coming north during the Great Migration, it really did put into a good perspective how Howard Thurman grew up. And a lot of how he grew up has to do with how he's approaching some of the topics we're going to talk about. And so he grew up, he had both of his parents initially, but he grew up among a lot of segregation. He said that there were white worlds and black worlds, and they were separated by a wall of quiet hostility and overt suspicion. So he grew up in this literally one side of the tracks and the other side of the tracks. But he also talked about when he was younger, a playmate of his that was a young white girl hit him with a rock. And when he screamed, she said, "What are you screaming for? You people don't hurt." And so it's very interesting when you think of episodes like that, because you can look at current medical research and actually see that there is a vast difference in the estimated pain tolerances that physicians have of people by race. So even to modern day, you'll see medical studies that show people assume that skin color impacts one's propensity to feel pain. And so he also found that it was a place of hope. He said that when he was younger, he got to see Mary McLeod Bethune start her school. That's now Bethune-Cookman College, but she was a well-known educator. And he knew the mission that she was fulfilling. And he said the most memorable aspect of seeing her on Sunday afternoon speaking was that there was a lack of segregation in the seating arrangements. It just gave him a view of the possibility that he could realize into his future. And so it seems like looking at segregation negatively and trying to envision a more successful and integrated future was really planted during his youth, because he was always a very contemplative child. He grew up alone, had his parents with him, Alice and Saul Solomon Thurman, that's quite a name. And he grew up in a Christian household. However, his dad died of pneumonia when he was 7, and he was there with him when he passed away. And one of the themes that developed in him happened after his father's death. The childhood church wouldn't do the funeral for his father because they said his father was not a Christian and they would not let him be buried in the church cemetery. But his mother and his grandmother were Christians. And so when he was a young child, as many of us, I don't know if any of you all are only children, but if you're an only child, you do a lot of thinking by yourself and a lot of contemplation. And Thurman started looking at just the hypocrisy of this. So these dogmatic rules of faith and religion versus what he perceived was actually supposed to happen in reality. And in modern language and in the culture I grew up in, this is called church hurt. And so this particular church hurt, which is very, very deep, it's the ones that you trust the most who can hurt you the most. But this was a catalyst for the creative tension that I think he saw between being a man of deep and mystical faith, yet being solidly against the church from the standpoint of he was for the church, he was for Christianity, he was definitely for Jesus. However, he was against what we call churchianity. So he was against the dogma, he was against the hypocrisy. And he later starts to talk about embracing the religion of Jesus, not the religion about Jesus. And so I want to talk a little bit about his life, and then how some of that trauma helped him to start thinking more critically about church. And so I think about the extreme loneliness he must have felt, because he had to help dress his father's body. He was there when he died. And he started to find solace in a tree, a big oak tree that was behind his house. And he would go there and he would talk to the tree and he would lean up against the tree. And if you were to read his autobiography with Head and Heart, you'll see just how deeply he started to develop his meditation. And at a time when everything was going topsy-turvy, you have a man here who is a critical thinker who connects to nature, because he used to find solace in the beach, in Daytona Beach, and the ocean waves, and also in this tree. And he said, when I was young, I found more companionship in nature than I did among people. And he said that nightfall was meaningful to his childhood, for the night was more than a companion, it was a presence. There was something about the night that seemed to cover my spirit like a gentle blanket. So for those people that are adherents to different faith traditions, the notion of being still and of listening and contemplating and meditating and being mindful, these are things that this little boy in the early 1900s started to do, which is just actually mind-blowing to me. So part of looking at how Thurman came to be Thurman has to do with that hypocrisy of not burying his father in the cemetery. Another thing that really impacted him was after his dad died, he was raised by his grandmother. And he learned how to read by reading the Bible to his grandmother regularly. However, she would tell him certain parts of the Bible don't read those parts from Paul that talk about slaves obey your masters. And so she would tell him to skip those parts of the Bible. And so at that point, he also started to think critically about religion and Bible and reality and the parts that she did not want him to read. And then he spent a lot of time alone as a child, as I said, and he was extremely thoughtful and gifted. And as was the case in the American South, I know one set of my grandparents, I think they went to like maybe second and fourth grade before they came north to work in the factories. And the other pair of grandparents, I think, went to sixth grade and eighth grade in Mississippi before moving north. And so like other Black children that grew up in the early 1900s, education was not only not a priority, the segregation didn't allow it. And even if they had a chance to go to school, most Black children didn't, because they had the economic pressures of those that were in the sharecropping system that emerged after the Civil War that kind of entrapped people, or people were just poor. And so anyway, Howard was very gifted, and he managed to persist until the eighth grade. And he actually became the first Black student to complete the eighth grade in Daytona Beach Public Schools. So first Black student to do that. And so there was no high school in Daytona Beach for Black children. And so he had to raise funds to attend a school in Jacksonville, Florida, Florida Baptist Academy. And there was an interesting story there. He had gotten the money together to get to Florida Baptist Academy. He'd raised the money from church and, different people like that. But he didn't have enough money to ship his trunk with him. He hadn't thought about the fact that he needed the money to ship the trunk. And he said he was just sitting on the train depot steps and just crying. And he said all of a sudden he sees this pair of feet walk up to him, this man. And the man says, "Why are you crying?" It's an older Black man. And he says, he's not going to be able to go to school because he can't ship the trunk. And the man gave him the money to ship it. And he said for the rest of his life, he wondered who that man was, because that person really just made a difference to him in his life. And so anyway, he ends up going to Florida Baptist Academy in Jacksonville, and he graduates as valedictorian. So this is, young and gifted. He then went on to, well, I won't say the best college, but one of the best colleges. He went on to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, and he attended school with Martin Luther King Sr., whose name at that time was Michael King Sr., because we talked about that last year in Black History Month, that Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr. were originally named Michael. And then the father found out about the Protestant Revolution and Reformation, and he renamed himself Martin Luther and renamed his son Martin Luther. And while at Morehouse College, which to date is the only historically Black college or university that is all male, Howard Thurman read every book in the library, and you have several people who have confirmed that. And he graduated as valedictorian from Morehouse in 1923. And a couple of years later, he was ordained a Baptist minister. So it's very interesting that he pursued ordination because he was always reading the Bible with his grandmother, ever curious about Christianity, but yet saw the hypocrisy and not burying his father, saw the hypocrisy in the parts of the Bible that his grandmother, who was formerly enslaved, didn't want him to read, but yet his faith is so deep and his belief in Jesus is so strong, he goes ahead and gets ordained as a minister. And so a couple of years later, he goes to Rochester Theological Seminary, which is now, I think, Crozer Colgate Seminary, and he graduates as valedictorian. So you've got this intellectual powerhouse in the building here. And after he pastored for a while in Oberlin, Ohio, taught a little bit, I believe at Oberlin College, he moved to Atlanta and took a joint teaching position at Spelman and Morehouse. So he comes back to his alma mater to teach. And so it's interesting looking at the parallels between Thurman and King. So in 1929, which is the year Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born, Howard Thurman read a book by an influential Quaker, Rufus Jones, called Finding the Trail of Life. And when he read that book, a lot of the Quaker tradition has to do with listening and sitting in circles with each other. And when a person has a problem, you sit until you feel that God has given you something constructive to help that person. Well, it really makes sense when you look at Thurman's early life. because he had all that solitude, and he was sitting out there with that oak tree listening, and he was telling the oak tree all of his problems. So you have a very contemplative child who, when he finds out about Rufus Jones' work and the Quakers, he's intrigued because this really resonates with him. And so he went to figure out how to study with Rufus Jones at Haverford College. And the two developed a friendship as two fellow mystics. They were from diverse cultures, diverse faith backgrounds. However, what drew them together was the contemplative nature and the trust in God. And so Thurman's relationship with Rufus Jones was so pivotal to Thurman that Thurman said he was indebted to Jones for so large a share in helping him stake out the areas of thought and interpretation of experience, which drove Thurman's career for decades. So Thurman credits talking with Rufus Jones with and the mentoring relationship there with crediting the rest of his career. Specifically, Thurman said that Jones and the Quakers gave him confidence in the insight that the religion of the inner life could deal with the real lived experience of man without retreating from the demands of that experience. So in my culture and generation, we say things about people, you so heavenly bound, earthly good, which means that you're just so studying and praying and meditating and and whatever you're doing that you're no earthly good. And what Thurman said he learned from the Quakers was that the religion of your inner life was sufficient, the grace is sufficient to deal with the external empirical experience. And Thurman realized that the religion of his inner life at its best was life affirming rather than life denying. And that dialectic between life affirming and life denying is kind of a rubric or a dialectic that he puts on the church, and he just sits in this creative tension from beginning to end. And so, having always been reflective and always having seen God through nature, in trees and in the ocean, it's not surprising that this would really resonate with him. And this helped him to get through different situations. For example, he got married to a beautiful woman named Katie Kelly, but they had a daughter and she died, and his wife died very young. I can't remember if it was tuberculosis or something like that. And so then he ended up remarrying a woman named Sue Bailey. So when you hear of Howard Thurman's wife, a lot of times you'll hear about Sue Bailey, but his first wife and the mother of his first child was Katie Kelly. But Sue Bailey, he married her, and she was actually a contemporary of I do believe King's wife. So the mother of Martin Luther King, because they're all around the same age. And of course, Sue Bailey went to Spelman, Howard Thurman went to Morehouse, King goes to Morehouse. And so I think this is also a good example to look at. There are a lot of things that we can learn about community belonging from HBCUs, because creating a community where people feel that they belong doesn't take millions and millions of dollars. There are a lot of things that HBCUs do well on a shoestring. And so those are some of the things that I'd really like to look at and look at how that community is built, because it's built very strong. But anyway, Thurman started to have his second really pivotal interfaith experience. So his first interfaith experience was coming in contact with Rufus Jones, who was the Quaker. His second interfaith experience happened. He took 4 people, including himself, as the first Black American dedication to British colonial India. So while India was still colonized by the British, Howard Thurman took 3 other people there, and they went to India, they went to modern day Sri Lanka and Burma. And his new wife, Sue Bailey, she was a force to be reckoned with the YWCA. So she was very professional, and they went on a trip to India. And they were invited there because the Indians were looking at, kind of the emancipation of slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all these different things, and how Blacks were fighting for freedom. And the Indians invited them there because they wanted to know what they could learn from Black Americans and how better to fight their own colonial struggle. So that's kind of why the trip came about. And Thurman was deeply impacted by the imperialism and by the untouchables, the caste in India at that time. What really touched him, he said, were that people, God's people, were so despised and humiliated that he felt that it had infiltrated their very identity. So he's very touched by the untouchables. And he had lots of interfaith opportunities there. And he interacted meaningfully with Hindus, with Buddhists, with Muslims. Because if you think about it, he's been this contemplative mystic his whole life. He's been considering the divine. He's been fighting against being enmeshed in dogma, which explains why he was only an ordained minister in a particular denomination for a couple of years, because the notions of a denominational religion were boxing him too much, and he's this big thinker. So anyway, he said those gatherings with Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims exposed him to the multiple ways that people worship. And he had the epiphany that the essence and the authority of their experiences was every bit as authentic as his experiences were to him. And he started to see men and women of all faiths as his brothers and his sisters. And so one of the most impactful things was that he got to talk to Gandhi when he was there. And he was intrigued by Gandhi's notion of nonviolence. And this was where Howard Thurman's commitment to nonviolence came from. So when you zip forward, so this is in 1935, 36, when you zip forward 30 years to Martin Luther King, that's coming from mentorship from Howard Thurman, that nonviolent philosophies coming from Howard Thurman, which he got from Gandhi. And so Thurman was really deeply impacted by Gandhi's commitment to nonviolent social change because it resonated so much with Thurman's previous thinking about Jesus. Also, another pivotal incident that happened with Thurman while he was in India was that an Indian attorney asked him how could he, as a Black American, be there representing Christianity, given that Christian treatment of Blacks in the United States, how could he be there representing Christianity? And a quote that Howard Thurman made, he said, he was not there representing the religion about Jesus, but representing the religion of Jesus. And so Thurman was one of the first Black thinkers to actually dissect Christianity, because previously, and still to modern day, Christianity, manifest destiny and all these different things is proposed to us as the religion of the powerful, so we're going to help the least of these, and we're the powerful and we're blessed. And it was also the religion of the slave holding caste. And many people, if you've never seen Birth of a Nation, it explains so much. Watch that movie. I had to watch it for a class, blew me away, because I met a woman in Charleston, an older woman, white woman, and she told me that she didn't know that the Ku Klux Klan was a racist organization. She said she thought that it was just an organization that protected women. That was honestly what she thought. And when I watched Birth of a Nation, I understood why she thought that, because it was founded allegedly to protect the virtue of white women. And so she only heard that aspect of the Klan. And so while all these things are going on in the name of religion, Thurman looks and does a lot of studying about Jesus, and looks at the behavior and the sensibilities and the religion of Jesus. So how did Jesus live? What did Jesus think? What did Jesus do? Versus what is the Bible saying? So he's reached the same cross point where his grandmother reached. She was still a Christian. She read her Bible, but she didn't want to read that part about slaves obey your masters. The reason she didn't want to read that was because she, being formerly enslaved, was the recipient of the Bible beating to try to convince her that it was an ideal state for her to be in, to be oppressed. Anyway, the difference in those prepositions, the religion about Jesus versus the religion of Jesus, really can't be overstated. So now Thurman starts to marry his views of Jesus's distinction and how to go about life with Gandhi's nonviolent social action philosophy. And this is what started to really combust his thinking. So once they get back, Thurman goes to Howard University to teach theology. And later he serves as the dean of Rankin Chapel, which that's like the holy grail of like chapel assignments, Howard University's Rankin Chapel. In 1944, Thurman leaves a tenured position at Howard to help establish the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. Have y'all ever heard of that? So there's this church. So in 1944, he leaves a tenured position. So the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, also known as the Fellowship Church, it's located in San Francisco, and he served as a co-pastor with a white minister who was named Reverend Fisk. And the point of the church was to have the fellowship of all peoples. It was deliberately interracial. It was deliberately multiple genders, deliberately multiple cultures and languages. They had praise dance before praise dance existed. They had types of worship, poetry and spoken word and acting. And when you look at some of the pictures of this church, it really is, we talk about, I think it's Revelation 7, what church should really look like, or what any religion should really look like. It should have all people in it. And so he leaves to co-pastor this church. And then 5 years later, he releases a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. And so at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about that book, because it's the start of the book. If you wonder what it's about, the first line of it is just so pivotal, because if you think about the timing of 1949, what's happening in the US? So World War II ended in 1945. All the American GIs are back. Very high numbers of Black people served in the service. But then you look at how they're treated when they come back. They're not treated as citizens. They are still coming back into the situations despite serving, despite saving people. They actually come back to a situation of continued oppression. And so the way Howard Thurman opens this book, he says, many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teaching and the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But few of these interpretations deal with what the teachings and the life of Jesus have to say to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall. So he writes this book looking at the teachings of Jesus and what Jesus has to say to those who are oppressed. Because previously, the Bible has just been seen as something for those in the oppressing classes. And so when he's talking about people with their backs against the wall, he's talking about people who are poor, people who are disenfranchised, people who are ostracized, people who are being subjugated to unfairness and inequities. And at this point, he's writing racially, but the book is still so very applicable now when we look at the various things that are happening in society. So I wanted to share a little bit with you about some of the key teachings of this book. First of all, he positions Jesus differently. He positions Jesus as a Jewish man. He positions Jesus as a poor Jewish man. So not just this ethereal being with the flowing blonde hair and blue eyes from the Middle East, but he positions him as a poor Jewish man because Jesus was born into a class of people that were being oppressed by the Roman government. So Jesus is in the ethnic minority. Jesus is also in an oppressed class. He then positions Jesus as a poor Jewish man from a minority group, and he positions him as a poor Jewish man from a minority group being oppressed by an empire. So this is one of the first theological works where, when you look at the history of the church in the United States, one of the reasons they didn't want enslaved people to read was because if you actually read that Bible, it's quite an empowering book. And so, of course, finally, when you look at the history of how the church developed among enslaved people, of course, the Exodus narrative is the thing that has the most oomph because they've been enslaved and they get free. Anyway, then Thurman connects Jesus's experiences to all poor people and to Black people. In fact, this book was reported by many people. Martin Luther King always had this book, Jesus and the Disinherited, with him. Lerone Bennett, who's Martin Luther King's biographer, said during the Montgomery bus boycott, King read and reread Thurman's 1949 book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which interprets Jesus's teaching through the experiences of the oppressed and the need for a nonviolent response to such oppression. And so that's really novel. And it's really mind-blowing if you can think of being in an oppressed group and being that impacted by Gandhi's teachings on nonviolent social change. And so what does the book talk about? Well, it talks about what Thurman calls the 3 hounds of hell. And these are 3 things that have to go away before oppression goes away. The first thing he talks about is fear. And he talks about the fear that we have of each other. He talks about the fear that those who are the oppressors have, ironically, of the people that they're oppressing. So when we look at oppression and we look at racism, no one benefits from it, because the people who are doing the oppressing have consciences. Those consciences are pricked, guilt flows. Anybody that makes you feel guilty, you start to develop resentment for, and then you start to think, well, if someone did that to me, I know what I'd do in response. So then you become fearful of the person. So this oppressive behavior and systems and whatnot, they ruin the people who are doing the oppressing, and they certainly ruin the lives of the people whose dignity is being snatched and who are being oppressed and treated unfairly. And so Thurman says that we've got to get rid of fear. So fear is the first of the 3 hounds of hell. The next hound of hell that he talks about is hypocrisy, of saying one thing and doing another. And you can just see his hypocrisy within Christianity. It's been building his whole life, from my dad was a good person, my mom went to church, my grandma went to church, but the pastor won't do the funeral and he can't be buried with the family, to looking at other situations of where the church is falling short. And so hypocrisy in government and in relationships has to go. So that's the second hound of hell. And the third hound of hell is hatred. Nelson Mandela was quoted as saying that hatred is like drinking poison and expecting it to kill the other person whom you're mad at. Thurman talks about the danger of hatred, because that hatred, he talks about how it corrupts the soul. And one of the things he proposes is a love ethic. And so he ends the book by talking about the importance of love. And one of the quotes that stands out to me, and I'll just stop in a second because I just go on and on about this forever, but one of the quotes that stands out to me is that he says that love can only exist between 2 freed spirits. And so he's saying that if 2 people's spirits are not free, love cannot exist. So if we talk about loving our neighbor as ourselves, we have to free ourselves. We have to free ourselves of the fear. We have to free ourselves of the hate. And we have to free ourselves of the hypocrisy. And he basically says about love that in order to love and to be free, one has to destroy pride. and let it go. And so thinking that you're better than another person by virtue of any factor, that pride just has to go away. You know, humility, and a deep humility has to exist. He also says that to experience love, we have to reject and put down deliberately any personal privileges that we have, or our perceived sense of moral superiority or moral supremacy. Because as long as we have those feelings, we are distancing ourselves from each other. And he also says that love requires an intentional assault on the desire to have anyone as an enemy. There's an excerpt that I wanted to read to you before I end, to kind of let you know where this love only occurs between the freed spirit. Basically, what Thurman says is that the religion of Jesus says to the disinherited, so the disinherited are the ones with their backs against the wall, says to them, love your enemy, take the initiative in seeking ways by which you can have the experience of a common sharing of mutual worth and value. It may be hazardous, but you must do it. He says, in the book, it says the Negro, which is what it says on my birth certificate. For the Negro, it means that he must see the individual white man in the context of a common humanity. The fact that a particular individual is white and therefore may be regarded in some overall sense as the racial enemy must be faced. An opportunity must be provided, found, or created for freeing such an individual from his white necessity. So what he's saying is we have to see people as hard as it is, regardless of what group the person belongs to. We have to free the person from he calls it white necessity. From this point on, the relationship becomes like any other primary one. So he's talking about the pure relationships that we have with family, that we have to start to connect to people beyond and let go of the racial part. Then he says, once an attack is made on the enemy status and the individual has emerged, the underprivileged man or woman must himself be status free. So he's saying that the person whose back is against the wall also has to let go of their own Black necessity. They've got to let it go to try to be free. Thurman says it may be argued that so this is the Black person, his sense of freedom must come first. Here, I think the answer may be determined by the one who initiates the activity. But in either case, no matter who initiates it, the white person or the Black person, love is only possible between two freed spirits. And it ends by saying, what one discovers in a single experience in which barriers have been removed may become useful in building an overall technique for loving one's enemy. There cannot be too great insistence on the point that we are here dealing with a discipline, a method, a technique, as over against some form of wishful thinking or simply desiring. So what he's talking about is transcendence. He's talking about transcending identity on both parts to engage with each other. And that's the hypocrisy of what he saw not happening in Christianity in the United States. And so it's hard to do and it's difficult to do, but Thurman thinks that it is necessary to strengthen that relationship that people had with their creators. And so this is just a little bit about Howard Thurman and who he was and kind of what he thought. It doesn't even begin to scratch the surface, but he's definitely a hidden figure in the civil rights movement. And I'm convinced that if we are to engage in healing wounds that exist between people, there have to be some courageous people who were willing to experiment with putting down that ascribed identities and interacting as humans, interacting spiritually. And so this is some of the work that we try to do with the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation movement that's on the different campuses. That's work that I've been involved in doing, and that's some of the ethos that is consistent with Thurman's teaching about racial healing. And it's hard work, because a lot of times we hold on to our woundedness, which is very real. A lot of times we hold on to the stereotypes that others have of us, the stereotypes we have of them. But I'll just end at this point by saying that Thurman says love only exists between two free spirits. And so we have to try to free ourselves of things so that we can try to find a new way, because keeping doing what we've been doing is not getting us to where Thurman and many others thought we could be. So I'd love to open it up for discussion and Q&A, but I am obsessed with Howard Thurman, purely obsessed.
Thank you so much. This was rich and a good introduction for some to Howard Thurman, a good reminder for others. Are there questions tonight? We want people to join in.
I had a quick question. This is Kai.
Hi, Kai.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Smith. I just thought this was delicious. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I wanted you to know that I'm holding my Howard Thurman book as well, Jesus and Disinherited. I have Jesus and Disinherited, and I have Meditations of the Heart. Yes. I don't have the autobiography, but I'll get it now. I just had a couple of things, and then I'll give it back over to you. One is I came to know about Howard Thurman through someone who is locally there in LA. I was just wondering if you're familiar with this person, and his name is Michael Bernard Beckwith. Do you know Michael Bernard?
I've heard of him before, and I've listened to him.
So he actually attended Morehouse, and that's how he learned of Howard Thurman. Mm-hmm. And of course, I've studied King my whole life and never really heard of Howard Thurman. Mm-hmm. So I was curious. I think you may have mentioned you became aware of Howard Thurman doing seminary. Is that what you said? How did you learn about it?
So the way I learned, so I went to Spelman. And so the way I heard the name Howard Thurman was because there was Thurman Hall. And so I was like, all the halls are named after really important people, but I just knew he was important. You hear a name and the person's important, but you haven't done any reading. And so at the Interdenominational Theological Center, the ITC, which is around the corner from Morehouse Clark, Spelman, and Morris Brown, I am an ordained AME minister. And so during seminary at this HBCU seminary, I took a course. The course was just about Howard Thurman. And the reason I took the course was because I had started reading, actually my friend Estelle sent me Head and Heart, the autobiography. I mean, she's a Candler, by the way. Well, she was a Candler. And I just started reading his writing, and it just started making sense because he's on a whole different plane, just on a whole different channel frequency. And I said, we're not going to get anywhere different if we keep doing the same thing, which is that Einstein quote, the meaning of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And so that's where I really started to delve into Thurman. Was during a class last spring in seminary that was just on Thurman. And I'm convinced I could study him the rest of my life and never, I've got to talk with Dr. Fluker, who's the keeper of all of his papers. And Thurman's amazing.
And what is your best answer to date of why he is a so-called hidden figure? Like, why is he so obscure, do you think?
One reason I think he's so obscure is that he's so intellectual. You can't capture him in sound bites or a bumper sticker or anything. So I think he's obscure for that reason. I think he's also obscure because he never sought not to be obscure. He just kept doing the work. But all of the people in the civil rights movement who were in the King camp and who were valuing nonviolence, and who, you know, SCLC, they all knew about him because he was a sound theologian, and he was kind of the pastor of the civil rights movement. He was the consigliere to the ones who were doing the marching, but he was never doing the marching. And in the United States, we tend to value that extroversion, and we tend to value that assertiveness, and we tend to value the flashy. And he was not flashy, and he was very intellectual and very deep and very thoughtful.
Fascinating. And you said that building was on, that building that he's named after, that's on Morehouse's campus.
Correct. His alma mater.
I got to get my son to Morehouse. He's a freshman in college. I'm trying to get him to.
He's a freshman in college or high school?
Sorry, inside high school, and he's pursuing volleyball. And Morehouse just started to implement a big volleyball program.
Take him to homecoming. Take him to homecoming so you can see all the Spelmanites.
My daughter's going to Spelman in, she's a junior. She's going to Spelman in April for a trip that a local nonprofit here is doing. It's a 7-day trip to Atlanta. She's going to visit. She's going to visit all.
Tour.
Yep.
Awesome. Is that the one Jack and Jill's doing?
No, it's a nonprofit. It's the Inaugural College Fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I hope she has a good time.
Me too. And thank you. This was like I said, it was delicious for me. I loved it.
Thurman is delicious. Other comments?
Hi, Dr. Goosby. My name is Manny. Nice to meet you. I'm a doctoral student in the EDOL program.
Ooh.
And I work in education. I work in a high school in the College Go Center. So I support the initiatives of everybody building a college identity. And one of the challenges, our school is half Latino and half Black. And I find it challenging at times building trust from our Black parents and our Black students. There's been times when they've said, you prefer the Latino students over our Black students. And one of the things I really strive is to give everybody the same respect. But I think some of my colleagues don't always do that. And I think there's still a lot of racial tensions between people of colors. And there's also lots of colorism. And so I was just wondering what your advice would be within just the people I work with. How do we create the conversation? And more importantly, to bring in that parent engagement to create trust, that we acknowledge that each child is special and that we're doing our best to create an equitable experience. But I know that maybe my efforts and how I do things isn't how my other colleagues work. And I think there's room for growth there, right? So that we can truly be doing that. So I was just wondering maybe what your advice for that would be.
One of the things that I've loved doing as part of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation movement. So I was co-director, then director of the center at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. And then I'm currently director of our Larry D. Kimmons Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative at Pepperdine. One of the things we do are community belonging circles. They're called racial healing circles. And what they do, they enable people they're a facilitated method of having people have discussions in dyads or trios about questions that impact their humanity. What they try to do is get people to see each other, freeing each other of their Latino necessity, of their Black necessity, of their white necessity, and try to get down to the humanity. Now, I do have to go on record and say, by no means am I advocating for colorblindness, because that is nonsensical. We all have heritages, we all have experiences that have happened to us based upon those heritages, based upon the colors that our skin is in. And nor am I saying that talking about race makes one racist. So I just have to say those things because somebody will hear what I've been saying about Thurman and think that that's what I'm saying. Absolutely not. These things are real, but at our core, we are human. I was listening to the new rabbi at the synagogue in Santa Monica. They just changed rabbis. I was virtually at her installation ceremony, and I'm trying to call her. The synagogue is I can't think of the name of the synagogue, but what she said, she positioned racism and ethnocentrism as idolatry. And I had never heard that before, but looking at that identity is what you're worshiping versus actually being a human being. So I would say one thing I would try would be to have some type of ground rules or touchstones for them to talk with each other, and then have a single unifying topic that they can discuss, or with you social psychologists, what was it, Tajfel and Turner? I can't remember which one it was, but when the kids are working together for a common purpose, that oftentimes can help to break down boundaries. So whether it's trying to get into college or trying to triumph over something, but it's really very hard, because that's one of the things that Thurman was talking about when he said that love can only exist among two freed spirits. And when you're only thinking about either what has happened to you and you're basing everything in your future based upon what has happened to you, it doesn't mean that what has happened to you is not valid. It doesn't mean that what has happened to you is not impactful, but it's also bounding you from where you can potentially go. So some of the things I would try to do would be to have situations where the kids and or the parents can talk about something that's commonly important to their human experience, not to their particular identities, but something that's very important, like goals for their children. But a lot of it does start with parents, and we pass these things down to our kids, you know. But that is a tough situation. It's very interesting too, because if you look at, you know, there's a divide and conquer. You go read The Prince by Machiavelli. It's so Machiavellian to divide people and have them fighting each other, because that actually helps the oppression to continue, because you could be allies and now you're busy being enemies. But that's a tough situation that you're in. But you can do it. I know you can do it. I think it's finding something common that they want, something common they can work for, or something common they can rally against. There's a book, not to give you more to read, 'cause you're a doctoral student. There's a book called the Social Functions of Conflict. I think it's by Kozer. And it talks about the value that conflict can have in bringing groups together.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Freedom writers. What's that? Say more, Cindy.
So I was thinking about what you were saying about finding the commonality amongst the students. In the movie Freedom Writers, which is based on a true story, the teacher was basically having a situation in her classroom where there are students from very different demographics and gangs and things like that. And there was a lot of tension in her classroom. And so she did an experiment where she asked a few questions, and it basically brought similarities. They could see that regardless of their gang affiliation, regardless of their background, their race, that they had things that were that they were similar in, right? So I'm just gonna use an example. She didn't use this, but you know, like how many people have seen this movie, right? But in her example, she was more so like, how many people know someone who lost someone to gun violence, right? And then they were all there. Or how many know someone that's incarcerated? They all stood there, right? And so it was just going and going and going till they can see the similarities amongst each other. And so it created like a family, like, oh, okay, we are alike. We do deal with the same things. We are mirroring each other's experiences.
Exactly. That's a wonderful example to look at that, that methodology, because those are those common experiences that are so basic to our humanity that maybe they can start to interact over that. But building the trust is the first thing. And we're just in a society where no one trust anybody, which again, not free. And so I applaud Thurman for taking that step and going in a completely different direction that was counter to where he was. You would never think that someone coming out of segregation and Jim Crow and lynchings and all of this would come up with this philosophy. But again, he didn't look at the religion about Jesus. He looked at the religion of Jesus, which says that we are to love. And what does love look like personified? I was trying to find the name of this, the rabbi, because I like to credit people when they say things, but I'll find it at some point. But yeah, it was just utterly amazing watching her get installed. And when she positioned racism as idolatry, I said, wow, I'll be darned. That's basically what Thurman is saying, to let go of those faulty beliefs.
Dr. J, as you continue to kind of talk about Thurman in the space of cultivating relationships. So if you're reading his writing, you realize that he cultivated an internal relationship, a wellspring, with God, and then that supported him in developing these relationships beyond and in those spaces that were not necessarily safe or helpful, but could be harmful, and yet was comfortable in that. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance, I think, for us as we're considering this hidden figure and what we can glean when it comes to cultivating relationships that start with our own internal space and move outward?
And I think that, we are all different types of faiths, belief systems, and things of that nature. But the one thing that I think we can all glean is that the criticality of having something that grounds you, and having something that grounds you to love, and having something that grounds you to the purpose of why you're here and what you are doing and who you are at a deep level, absent all of the socially constructed labels that we stick onto each other. And so one could look at it, let's say that one is not particularly a person of faith, but one very much values mindfulness. Well, what are you being mindful about? And what are your central value propositions? And who are you at your essence? And what is your best self? And what does it look like to manifest your best self? And where does your energy come from? And how do you stay connected to that and grounded and do what you're going to do? So I think that's one thing that I take away from him. As a person who is Christian, I take from him the importance of being still and knowing that God is God. Be still. Or as the kids say, go sit down somewhere and just be quiet and just sit and to think and to feel. I think that regardless of what a person's ethic system is or philosophical system is or religious system is, there is some teaching in there. Even if you're a naturalist, go be at the ocean and look at the moon and the fact that it comes up and how it controls the tides, and how as the tide comes in, it just washes away everything, and wherever you receive your power from. I think it's so important to remain connected to that source of power. So that's one thing I think I really took away from him, and that your connection to that source of power isn't mediated by something else. You have a direct connection to that source of power, to ground yourself, because it's so easy, whatever your behavioral value, religious, spiritual views are, all it takes is one meeting sometimes and you're off your rocker that you started off on so well when you got to work and had your coffee. And by the time the coffee's gone, if you don't constantly meditate frequently, pray without ceasing, or recenter yourself, however you do that, I think that's critical. to impact our relationships with other people. Because when we're off balance, we say unbalanced things, we think unbalanced thoughts, and we do unbalanced things that create more imbalance.
Are there any other questions for Dr. J tonight? Thoughts?
I don't have a question. I have an appreciation. This, Dr. J, this came right at a perfect time for me. It's divine intervention. About stages, and prayerful and mindful and all of that. When you're when it feels like an oppressed situation, I have a new job that I've had for about 60 days, and it just feels so oppressive. And particularly from my boss, the micromanagement, the way that I see that she treats African Americans, and just a lot of different things. I'm just like, oh God, how did I find myself in this oppressed situation? And even the other day, I put in my tagline, celebrate Black History Month, because there wasn't any reference to it or any form of celebration. It wasn't maybe 5 minutes before I was called into a meeting and was asked to remove that. Not even in a nice way, but in a very, we don't have our DEI strategy in place yet. And oh yeah, you could be a part of our DEI strategy when we get it, but can you go ahead and take that down? I was just so angry.
That's fear.
Yes.
On your part.
That's, oh, good. I'm glad you
One
said
of
that.
the hounds of hell. That is fear. And it's also hypocrisy.
Absolutely. I wrote that down when you talked about the 3 different ones from Thurman. So I said, okay, this is fear. I did actually think that, but it didn't matter to me at that time that it was fear. I was so angry. Of course, I think about Harriet Tubman. I'm like, let me get out of here and take everybody I can with me. And I'm like, you know what? There's a Rosa Parks that lives in me. I'm going to keep my Celebrate Black History Month up there. I'm just going to sit and be, civilly disobedient. But then because I am a Christian and because I, am fascinated by racial healing, that did run through my mind, but it ran very quickly. And then I forgot about it until you brought it back up again. I'm from born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. And it's
I'm from Gary.
Okay, Indiana, okay.
Yep.
So it's very segregated, people are in Detroit, and then you go past 8 Mile, like in the movie, and that's where people work, and that's where you find different things. So I am in one of the parts where there aren't a lot of African Americans there where I am. So, then I was like, I'm quitting because I don't have time for this. I'm trying to write a dissertation. I don't have time to teach you, and just all of this stuff. So even having this conversation tonight, just makes me feel like, okay, Lord, what am I supposed to do here? My normal thing, which is run and say, I don't have to deal with this. It's not my job to teach you. Or do I take this as an opportunity, leverage, so I don't know, any advice would be great.
Whatever your center is, whatever helps you to recenter, I would start with that. So for some people, it's even running. Some people it's meditation. Some people it's prayer. Some people it's singing. Some people it's gospel music. Some people it's the beach. But one of the things that happens during the dissertation process is that you become so imbalanced and in a precarious state. One of the crazy things I did during my PhD, my dissertation stage, I started taking drum lessons. I just so once a week for like 45 minutes, no dissertation, no nothing, but I would say to center yourself and just remember the best dissertation is a done dissertation. Just center yourself and keep plugging. I see Charlotta.
Thank you.
And know that you're not crazy. These things are happening, but there's a difference between your reacting and your responding. And when you recenter yourself, you're able to respond, which is a deliberate action versus just reacting off of the reflex. Crystal. I saw Crystal's hand up and I saw Charletta's hand up.
Hi, Dr. Goosby Smith. Thank you. Apologies for being late.
I'm glad you're here.
I have gotten value from the part where I was here. So thank you so much for that. So I'd like your opinion, your perspective on the last part of what my homegirl and colleague Wendy shared, in that it's not my job to teach you. I struggle with that as well. I feel like it is my job. If not me, who? If not now, when? But it gets me into trouble. And understanding that Wendy is in a new role, how might you suggest? Because a little bit more. I just feel I struggle with, it's not my job to teach you. I struggle with that. I'm not saying anybody else should struggle with that. I am convicted by those hidden figures in Black history, and sometimes not so hidden figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was one of my inspirations. I wonder, what if he said, I don't have time to teach you? Where will we be as a society? I wonder if, not saying that I'm the next Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I am not. But I think it takes us as doctoral students, as global leaders, to have slightly a little bit more courage to be able to educate people, even when we really shouldn't have to. So what advice would you give us on ways that we can do that and be safe in doing it at the same time?
One of the things that Thurman said about love, the second thing was the rejection of a personal privilege or status or sense of moral supremacy or superiority. And regardless of who you are, if you think that you know more or know better than another person, you are in a state of moral superiority. And so I would say to look at, again, recentering, and to look at what are you here for? In my language, in my Christian tradition, I call that calling. And over time, it has been very clear why I am here and what I'm called to do. And everybody's called to do something different. However, I think that it comes also to a point of, what am I trying to do and why? What's my motive? So am I trying to teach you because I think that you are offensive and you're ignorant and you need to know better? If so, that's coming from that place of moral superiority. I'm doing a workshop with Masters of Science and Organizational Development alumni. It's a panel discussion on the 16th of March around lunchtime. And the title of it is Self as Instrument, because anytime you come into a situation, you are an instrument of something.
Did you go to Pepperdine? Did you go through the MSOD program at Graziadio?
No, but my PhD is in organizational behavior, but I'm working with their alums to do this.
Yeah, they're very big on self as instrument.
Oh, it's huge, because you are an instrument of something, every room you step into. And I think that being cognizant of that and being intentional about what you want to be an instrument of can also help. Some people are instruments of fighters and calling people to task. And that's what they're called to do. They call out wrongs that are happening. Other people are called to teach other things, other people are called to intervene. And so I think though that when looking at how to intervene and be safe, the be safe part comes from a place of fear. And Thurman is saying that fear is one of the hounds of hell. And how do you get over fear? It's by reconnecting to source, reconnecting to whatever your source is. And so for me, it's my prayer life and my calling and why am I here and what am I supposed to be doing? And my call is to unite God's people. That's why I went into diversity work, because that was the call that I received. I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll go into work and help people understand each other. And then after my dad died in 2018, I literally heard an audible voice that said, now what's your excuse? So the real call is to go into ministry and do a lot of interfaith work. And so, but there is no safety really in using yourself as instrument. But if you think about it, your safety comes from your connection to whatever your source is. So reframing who you're there for and remembering who you are and not conforming to the madness that's going on, but trying to keep your connection to something higher and better so that you can transcend it and transform it. That was what I really think attracted me to Thurman, because he's very clear in this book about racism and how it works and the things that happen. And he's not mamby-pamby cotton candy, but he's talking about transcending and how healing can actually occur. But I also think it's not rational for me to expect you to know something that I know and to punish you for not knowing it, but yet not open myself enough to help you understand it. I can't punish you for not knowing my favorite food if I never tell you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. That's super duper helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We could go on all night, but I want to honor our time. I want to thank you for being here, for sharing Howard Thurman, the mystic, the prolific writer, the man of God, who is now part of all of our sphere, to kind of think through how we show up in the world and how we then use our voice and our gifts to make a difference. So thank you so much. Thanks each of you for being here. Hope you will join us tomorrow night for the student panel. We look forward to having you. We hope that you're enjoying Black History Month and all that we are seeking to offer and the voices that we're seeking to share with you as we celebrate our hidden figures. So I bid you blessings on your evening and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.